Okay, my talk today is going to be on root-lesion nematodes, the bad girls of the soil environment, and on mycorrhiza, which are the good guys. Okay, 3 take-home messages today. Root-lesion nematodes are likely to be in your paddocks. You've heard it from Steve, you hear it from me as well. Now, test your soil for nematodes before you choose a tolerant wheat variety, and you're going to maximise your yields. The other thing to be aware of, though, if you grow resistant crops that have resistance to root-lesion nematodes, be aware of their mycorrhizal status, and I'll explain that later. So Steve's already covered this, but I'll go through it again. The management of root-lesion nematodes depends on 4 key things. Number 1, have your soil tested in a laboratory for nematodes. I've got some handouts at the back there where I've got some posters and we've got the submission forms. Protect your paddocks that are not infested. Just in addition to what Steve was saying there, these nematodes will move in water as well as soil. So they actually live in the water in the soil. They're swimming between the soil pores. So any water that's moving is carrying the nematodes. They love water and they will survive. They won't necessarily all drown. Now next, choose tolerant wheat varieties to maximise your yields and rotate with resistant crops because resistant crops will stop root-lesion nematodes from increasing. Is there anything else you can do? Well, don't forget about applying fertilizer at the recommended rates and get the most out of these tolerant wheat varieties that you have chosen. Now in 2011 we received samples from 164 paddocks with our Test Your Farm for Nematode service. So we've got samples there from Roma down to Forbes. And it's the same story that Steve was telling you. 84% of these, the samples that we received contained root-lesion nematodes and most of them contained Pratylenchus thornei. And these results are similar to what we found in previous years and very similar to a survey that we did of about 900 paddocks in the northern region. The only big change was about 61% of the samples had root-lesion nematodes above that threshold level. Now, this is probably a reflection of the good season in 2010. We have tolerant plants that may be susceptible with big root systems. They support a lot of nematodes. And these nematodes can lay a lot of eggs and if they've got a good environment. Okay, here's another example of the benefit of wheat tolerance. So what we have here on the y-axis is we're going from the tolerant Gregory down to intolerant Strzelecki. And this is planted on our Pratylenchus thornei site at Fall Martin on Darling Downs. So Gregory, yielding about 5 tonnes per hectare, Strzelecki about 3.5. We're looking at about a 32% yield loss in this trial. Now we did the same trial a couple of weeks later at the same site with Pratylenchus thornei. Gregory's still performing well, about 5 tonnes per hectare, but Strzelecki is losing a little bit more than the earlier planting. So looking at about a 43% yield loss, and that's a huge number. So part of the explanation for this is the importance of perhaps soil temperature on these nematodes. So temperature is important for their rates of growth, movement, even reproduction. Apparently there's some root-lesion nematode species that will even determine which sex they end up being. So we found from our glasshouse experiments that the optimum temperature for Pratylenchus thornei is about 22 degrees, and this is what we run all of our glasshouse experiments at. So if you're planting an intolerant variety in soil that's starting to warm up, the nematodes are very happy, they're reproducing. I think they're looking at laying about 40 eggs every 6 weeks, and they'll go through several generations in a cycle. So there's a huge population of nematodes there to attack intolerant wheat varieties. Okay, let's change tack for a minute. Can I just have a show of hands? Has anyone in the audience grown canola or advised about growing canola? Okay. Has anyone been disappointed with the wheat that has followed their canola crops? Just a show of hands again? Okay, 2. All right, when John Cameron was putting this session together, he asked about our experiences with wheat, and we do have canary as well following canola. And I'll explain what we have found in a couple of our experiments. Okay, so we're going to change to mycorrhizae at the moment. Mycorrhizae are beneficial fungi, and they've been mentioned quite often during the update, which is good to hear. They colonise plant roots and they assist plants in the uptake of poorly mobile nutrients like phosphorus and zinc. And many crops grown in the northern region depend on mycorrhizae. So this is taken from a brochure which I have copies of up the back here where I've got some posters set up about the mycorrhizal dependence of many crops. So you can see that some crops with high mycorrhizal dependence are linseed, fava bean and cotton. Chickpea has a high mycorrhizal dependence. Wheat is listed here as having a low mycorrhizal dependence, but I'll give you an interesting example of where mycorrhiza can become important for wheat. But here's the important thing: canola is independent, it doesn't depend on mycorrhiza. So just looking at some experiments that we've done, we've had at our thornei site again at Four Martin, we've grown 2 separate experiments. We had winter crops and then we followed either with wheat or with chickpea. So canola is resistant to Pratylenchus thornei, populations will decrease, but it's not a host of mycorrhizae. So when canola is grown, mycorrhizal spores will decrease in the soil. Okay, first experiment. Now, I think it shows up nicely on the screen here, it might not show up for you. So what we had here was the pre-crops. Here's an example of fallow, which doesn't support mycorrhizal populations. The chickpea is looking a little bit yellow and there's a bit of space between the plants there. But in contrast, where we've got linseed, which has high mycorrhizal dependence and leaves nice populations of mycorrhizae in the soil, the chickpea is looking a bit healthier. And if we look at the number of mycorrhizal spores in the soil after we have grown these crops, is significantly lower following canola and fallow compared to these other crops. So at this site, I've probably said to you that Pratylenchus thornei was also present, and it had a big effect on these chickpea varieties. So what we had here was linseed. This chickpea variety is looking much healthier following linseed, which is P. thornei resistant. But in contrast, the chickpea following wheat, which is P. thornei susceptible, is looking yellow and not as healthy. So what does this mean in terms of yield? Well, we got the best yields where we grew canary seed, which is thornei resistant and a mycorrhizal host. The poorest yields followed canola and fallow. So this is an experiment with a high thornei population, had a big negative effect on the yields of the chickpea, but there were benefits that were from the mycorrhiza. Now, if any of you have been listening, you'll be thinking, hang on a minute, what's linseed doing? And in this experiment, and I have said that linseed has high mycorrhizal dependence and is resistant to thornei, but in this experiment there were significantly more thornei following linseed than canary here. So what we have here is the effect of thornei bringing down that population. All right, let's swap to another experiment that I did a few years ago. Once again, it's on our thornei site and we grew winter crops and we followed them with wheat. So after we grew the winter crops, we had low populations of thornei following the canola and low populations of mycorrhizae following the canola, similar to the fallow. So this is number of mycorrhizal spores here. Now, in the second year of the experiment, we planted wheat on top of the plots, and the wheat growth was poorest following the canola or the fallow. So thornei-resistant mycorrhizal non-host. But this experiment is an interesting one. It was done in an extremely dry year. So we had only 12 millimetres of rain in the first 3 months after planting, and not much either side of that. So because the soil was so dry, the Pratylenchus thornei was not happy, and it removed the effect of Pratylenchus thornei. I think the soil was too dry for thornei to do anything. So what we had in this experiment was a really good example of the benefits of mycorrhizae to wheat. So what we have here is the colonisation of the wheat that we planted on top of those plots, and here we have the biomass of the wheat that was planted on the plots. So you can see the biomass is lowest following the canola and the fallow with the low mycorrhizal populations, highest after these crops that support high mycorrhiza. And it was a similar result for the yield of that second year wheat on these plots. So just in summary from that. So wheat benefited from mycorrhizae, even though it is generally considered to have a low mycorrhizal dependence. In this experiment we had very low phosphorus soil, only 7 milligrams Colwell P, and it was a very dry growing season. So mycorrhizal colonisation of wheat roots can provide better tolerance of drought conditions and increased uptake of phosphorus and zinc, leading to improved yields. Okay, so what do you do with all this information? As Steve has said, get your soil tested for nematodes. I've got some submission forms up the back there, and the information about Predictor-B, I'm sure you could talk to Steve to find out what to do. Choose a tolerant wheat variety. That information is available at NVT online, or the wheat varieties for Queensland, and I believe there's a wheat varieties for New South Wales as well with the same information. Now, don't forget to consider the mycorrhizal dependence and nematode resistance of your rotation crops to maximise yields, and we have brochures up the back with information about that. Thank you.